When we picture the British Empire, we often imagine maps covered in red, royal crowns, and ships crossing distant oceans. But the empire was not only a global system. It was also a social one. From the top of society to the bottom, from aristocrats in grand halls to factory workers in smoky streets, the British class system was shaped by empire. Wealth flowed from colonies into the highest levels of society. Middle-class professionals found careers in overseas administration. Working-class men joined regiments and served abroad. Even those who never left Britain felt the presence of empire in their jobs, their homes, their education, and their future. This is the story of how the British Empire shaped class, and how class shaped the empire in return. Hello and welcome. I hope you are doing well today. Thank you for joining this journey through time. Today, we explore a story hidden beneath royal crowns and naval victories. A story about people. About status. About opportunity and inequality. The British Empire did not just expand across the world. It also expanded across the layers of society. Aristocrats grew wealthy. Middle classes found ambition. Working people carried the weight of the empire on their backs. Before we begin, here is a question for you. Did the empire strengthen the British class system, or did the class system strengthen the empire? In the early 18th century, Britain stood on the threshold of global expansion while remaining deeply rooted in old social structures. At the top sat the monarchy and aristocracy, families whose titles and estates had defined power for generations. Beneath them was a growing middle class of merchants, professionals, and investors. At the bottom were laborers, servants, and rural workers who formed the majority of the population. These divisions were not simply social habits. They were the framework for how Britain understood itself. And they would influence how the empire developed beyond its shores. Life for those at the top moved at a distance from the rest of society. The monarchy and aristocracy lived in grand houses, managed estates, and moved in circles where influence was exchanged as easily as conversation. Their lives were shaped by inherited privilege. Decisions about trade, law, and foreign affairs were often discussed far from the places where those decisions would be felt. For them, expansion overseas represented opportunity. New territories meant new revenue. New alliances meant new leverage. Empire fit naturally into their world because it promised to reinforce the hierarchy that already existed at home. The rising middle class approached empire differently. Merchants, financiers, shipbuilders, and lawyers saw the world as a system of possibilities. Maps were studied. Contracts were drafted. Letters from distant ports carried news of profit or loss. This group did not hold traditional titles, but they held something increasingly powerful, economic influence. They invested in voyages, companies, and foreign markets. Expansion offered them a ladder upward, a way to gain status that was based on wealth rather than birth. For them, empire was not background. It was ambition. For the majority of Britons, the experience was more distant. Laborers, servants, and rural workers lived. Their days were structured by fields, workshops, and kitchens. Their futures were shaped by wages, harvests, and household demand. Many of them never traveled far from the places they were born. They heard stories in taverns or from sailors passing through port towns. They saw imported goods appear in markets. But empire was a shadow rather than a path. It offered possibility for others, not for them. These early impressions created a gap that grew wider with time. While the upper and middle classes treated overseas trade as a doorway, the working population remained on the outside. News of commercial victories in India or the Caribbean brought pride. But pride did not ease daily hardship. Those who labored to fuel the economy at home did not receive the rewards of global wealth. Empire strengthened the very divisions that already controlled society. It created winners, but not on equal terms. In London and other cities, offices and counting houses became symbols of this shift. Behind their doors, contracts legitimized control over distant territories. Decisions about goods, pricing, and shipping shaped outcomes in places most Britons could not locate on a map. Those with access to the right networks could turn speculation into fortune. Those without access continued to work for wages that barely supported a household. The class structure that began at home extended outward across oceans. In rural villages, the picture was quieter but equally shaped by change. Markets expanded. Rumors spread of fortunes made across the sea. Some young men left to join ships, hoping to return wealthier than when they left. Most did not return changed. The distance between expectation and reality became another thread in the fabric of inequality. By the 1730s, the social landscape felt set. Aristocrats maintained their authority. The middle class expanded with every successful trade venture. Laborers continued to build, farm, and serve without access to the structures that determined their futures. This was not accidental. It was the foundation on which empire rested. To expand abroad, Britain relied on a hierarchy at home. Those who commanded the empire did not experience the world in the same way as those whose labor supported it. As the decades progressed, the social structure hardened further. Colonial wealth strengthened the top of the hierarchy. The middle class solidified its position. The working population remained aware of empire only through rumor, newsprint, and second-hand description. It was increasingly clear that the ladder of opportunity did not extend evenly. For some, empire meant profit. For others, it meant distance. The era between 1700 and 1760 shows how class and conquest developed together. Britain did not become a global power first and a stratified society second. The two processes unfolded side by side. Hierarchy shaped expansion, and expansion reinforced hierarchy. The monarchy defined legitimacy. Merchants defined ambition. Laborers defined the foundation. The divisions of class became the blueprint for the divisions of empire. Looking back, this period reveals how deeply the roots of inequality were planted. Before forts were built or treaties signed, before colonies were administered or territories claimed, Britain had already constructed the social scaffolding that would guide its empire. Class existed before conquest. Conquest deepened class. Empire became a ladder for the few and a distant horizon for the many. It promised possibility, but the path to reach that possibility was not the same for everyone. In these early decades, Britain learned how to see the world through layers. Layers of wealth. Layers of access. Layers of expectation. And once those layers formed, they became part of the structure of society itself. The foundation of class and conquest was laid quietly, before history recorded its louder moments. It was laid in counting houses and estates. It was laid in workshops and fields. It was laid not just in maps, but in minds. By the mid-18th century, the pattern was clear even if it remained unspoken. Empire was becoming a system with winners and witnesses. Those who shaped it. Those who financed it. And those who lived beside it without ever touching its rewards. The foundation was in place, and history would build the rest. In the second half of the 18th century, the British aristocracy entered. The British aristocracy entered a new era of influence and wealth. The great families who had long relied on inheritance, land rents, and titles, discovered that imperial commerce offered opportunities unlike anything that had come before. The rise of trade companies, the expansion of overseas taxation systems, and exclusive commercial rights gave nobles the chance to multiply their fortunes far beyond the boundaries of their estates. Empire did not replace aristocratic privilege. It reinforced it. Throughout Britain, country houses grew in size and grandeur. Estates expanded through purchases funded by profits from colonial ventures. These properties became physical symbols of status, their stone walls, landscaped gardens, and decorative halls built on income that originated thousands of miles away. The timber for some beams came from overseas ports. The artwork that adorned gallery walls arrived through trade networks that crossed oceans. Even the tea served in drawing rooms connected the family that drank it to the empire that supplied it. Many aristocrats became shareholders in major trading institutions. The East India Company and the West India trading networks attracted investors who held titles and influence in parliament. Wealth and governance became intertwined. Decisions made in London shaped life in Bengal, Jamaica, and other territories. And decisions made overseas determined how much profit returned to Britain. This relationship created a cycle in which aristocrats protected the systems that enriched them. And those systems strengthened their place at home. Members of parliament who invested in overseas ventures carried both political authority and personal financial interest. Their voices influenced debates about tariffs, monopolies, and military intervention. These policies determined trade routes, taxation agreements, and commercial privileges. The aristocracy did not simply observe imperial expansion. It directed it. Through votes, negotiations, and social connections, they helped shape the world that made them wealthy. This period reshaped how class operated in Britain. In earlier centuries, nobility relied on tradition to maintain their position. Now, they also relied on commerce. The marriage of title and capital created a new kind of aristocratic identity. They were no longer only custodians of ancestral estates. They became participants in a global market. Many did not sail across oceans or visit colonies in person. They did not supervise plantations or negotiate treaties. Their influence existed in signatures, charters, and shares. Yet the consequences of those decisions reached far beyond their view. Country houses became the visible proof of an invisible system. Their libraries contained maps of territories whose names few locals could pronounce. Their dining rooms hosted guests who discussed returns on investment as easily as hunting or politics. The estates that once represented lineage now represented profit. Servants polished silver paid for by taxes collected overseas. Landscaped grounds were trimmed by workers employed through income tied to distant plantations. The everyday beauty of these properties concealed the structures that enabled them. For the aristocracy, the empire provided protection as well as opportunity. Wealth insulated families from financial risk, allowing them to weather economic disruptions that harmed others. Political influence shielded them from consequences that might have threatened their status. If a trade venture failed, another could replace it. If criticism of imperial policy appeared, it could be dismissed as uninformed. The system did not guarantee perfect security, but it strengthened the social walls that preserved privilege. This connection between class and empire also shaped social expectations. Young heirs learned that maintaining status required more than managing land. It required understanding investment, negotiation, and the political landscape that maintained commercial rights. Marriages connected families not only for social standing, but for economic strategy. Wealth traveled with dowries that included shares and commercial interests. The empire became part of family planning as much as personal ambition. In public life, these aristocratic fortunes influenced culture. Wealth funded art, architecture, and charitable projects that shaped cities and towns. Theaters, museums, and educational institutions benefited from donations. On the surface, these contributions appeared to reflect generosity. Beneath them lay the profits of trade networks and taxation systems anchored far from Britain. The cultural legacy of this period cannot be separated from the economic foundations that supported it. Not everyone accepted this integration of empire and class without question. Some critics asked whether wealth gained through distant control justified its cost. They wondered why privilege seemed to grow as oversight diminished. Their voices were few, but they represented the first signs of a conversation that would expand in future generations. The aristocracy could not yet imagine that their position might be challenged, but the seeds of future debate began to form. By 1800, the landscape of British power had changed. Landowners who once ruled quietly from their estates now shaped decisions across continents. The boundaries between domestic authority and imperial ambition had blurred. The empire became a pillar that held up aristocratic identity. Status was no longer defined solely by birth. It was reinforced by wealth, and that wealth flowed from colonial systems that enriched some while displacing others. The period from 1760 to 1800 shows how class and empire grew together. It reveals the hidden architecture of privilege, built not only on heritage but on global commerce. It shows how estates, parliaments, and trading companies formed a network that protected those at the top. And it shows that the fortunes of the aristocracy were never isolated. They were connected by routes across the sea, by ledgers filed in counting houses, and by decisions made in committee rooms that shaped distant lives. The empire strengthened the walls around privilege. It built estates of stone and estates of influence. It secured wealth for generations who would inherit not only land, but the systems that produced it. This is the story of how aristocrats transformed imperial profit into permanence. And how that permanence became a defining feature of British society at the end of the 18th century. The middle class expands 1800 to 1830. In the first decades of the 19th century, Britain underwent a transformation that stretched far beyond the smoke of factories and the hum of steam engines. The Industrial Revolution did not only reshape machines. It reshaped society. A new class emerged between the wealthy elite and the working poor. This rising middle class searched for its place in a rapidly changing world, and the empire provided an answer. Overseas territories became not only distant possessions, but pathways to opportunity, status, and reinvention. Across Britain, families saw new possibilities opening before them. Newspapers printed advertisements for posts in India and the Caribbean. The empire offered higher wages, faster promotion, and a chance to rise more quickly than the crowded hierarchies at home allowed. Those who chose this path often began their journey in ports like London, Liverpool, or Bristol. They boarded ships with small bundles of belongings and large expectations. Some carried letters of recommendation from schoolmasters or local officials. Others relied on talent and timing. They did not see themselves as conquerors or rulers. They saw themselves as professionals stepping into a structure that promised reward in exchange for service. Their destination was a world defined by unfamiliar climates, new languages, and a system that needed their labor. When they arrived in colonial capitals, they encountered a different rhythm of life. Administrators reported to government officers in whitewashed buildings. Clerks copied reports at heavy wooden desks, their ink drying slowly in the heat. Teachers stood before classrooms that blended British lessons with local students. Engineers planned roads, rail lines, and drainage systems intended to reshape landscapes. These roles were not glamorous, but they carried authority. With authority came respect, and with respect came identity. The middle class at home lived in terraced houses, balancing the expectations of education and propriety. Overseas, those same individuals might be granted homes with staff, transport allowances, and wages that exceeded anything their local employers would have offered. The empire rewarded them not because of their social background, but because of what they could provide. It became a career system, a ladder that extended beyond the British Isles. The further they traveled, the higher they might climb. For many, this created a sense of loyalty to the imperial project. They believed that the empire was a force for order and improvement because their livelihoods depended on it. Their success felt like evidence of progress. They saw their work as part of a mission to build schools, courts, hospitals, and ports. For them, the empire was not a line of red ink on a world map. It was a system of employment. At the same time, the rewards of overseas service created distance. While they gained opportunity, others paid the cost. Local populations lived under the laws these administrators enforced. Workers built the infrastructure that engineers designed. Students learned from teachers whose lessons reflected British priorities. The middle class who traveled abroad rarely questioned the structure that elevated them, because it elevated them. The empire gave them the status they could not easily achieve at home. In drawing rooms across Britain, stories of overseas service became symbols of achievement. A son returning from India with savings and professional experience could transform a family's standing. A daughter who married an officer or administrator might return to Britain with a new social position. These personal advances fed into a cultural belief that the empire was not merely a structure of power, but a ladder anyone could climb. Ambition and geography became intertwined. As steam power intensified production and global trade expanded, opportunities grew further. Surveyors charted land for new rail lines, customs officers managed ports that moved goods across continents. Doctors and nurses joined colonial medical services, convinced they were bringing modern healthcare to places in need. Every profession found a place, every skill could be translated into authority. By the late 1820s, the middle class had become one of the engines of empire. It provided the personnel that kept records, enforced regulations, and maintained communication between London and the colonies. Without this class, the empire would have lacked structure. Without the empire, the class would have lacked direction. Each reinforced the other, even if neither intended to create a system of reliance. Yet beneath the success lay contradictions. The empire promised movement and mobility. But only for some. It opened doors for those who carried British credentials, while limiting the paths of those already living in the territories. It offered wages but required loyalty. It gave opportunity but demanded acceptance of its hierarchy. These conditions created a world where advancement for one group often meant limitation for another. The middle class rarely saw this imbalance clearly, because their lives were shaped by its advantage. Back in Britain, the expansion of this class changed how the public viewed overseas rule. For the wealthy, empire remained a source of profit. For the working poor, it remained distant. But for the middle class, it became a personal stake. They wrote letters home about their roles. They returned with souvenirs, savings, and reputations. They reminded their communities that the empire was not only a structure of power, but a place where futures were being built. This made the empire feel familiar, even to those who never left home. By 1830, the connection between class and empire was a pathway. It was not a pathway. It was mobility. Possibility. Between 1800 and 1830, the middle class expanded not only in number, but in ambition. They did not build the empire's boundaries, but they built its offices. They did not command its armies, but they carried out its decisions. They became the hands that turned the machinery of rule, the voices that filled its classrooms, and the pens that wrote its records. And in doing so, they discovered that the empire was more than a map. It was a career. Between 1830 and 1860, the British Empire appeared to many as a force of progress, wealth, and expansion. But for the working class at home, the empire was not a pathway to prosperity. It was something they felt indirectly, through the factories they worked in, the ships they built, and the machines they powered. Raw materials from distant territories arrived in ports and warehouses, then moved into the industrial heart of Britain. Cotton fed the textile mills. Timber and metal supported construction and manufacturing. Coal-fired engines that powered industry. Raw materials from distant territories arrived in ports and warehouses, then moved into the industrial heart of Britain. Cotton fed the textile mills. Timber and metal supported construction and manufacturing. Coal-fired engines that powered industry. But for the working class at home, the empire was not a pathway to prosperity. It was something they felt indirectly, through the factories they worked in, the ships they built, and the machines they powered. Raw materials from distant territories arrived in ports and warehouses, then moved into the industrial heart of Britain. Cotton fed the textile mills. Timber and metal supported construction and manufacturing. Coal-fired engines that powered industry. But for the working class at home, the empire was not a pathway to prosperity. It was something they felt indirectly, through the factories they worked in, the ships they built, and the machines they powered. Raw materials from distant territories arrived in ports and warehouses, then moved into the industrial heart of Britain. Cotton fed the textile mills. Timber and metal supported construction and manufacturing. Coal-fired engines that powered industry. But for the working class at home, the empire was not a pathway to prosperity. It was something they felt indirectly, through the factories they worked in, the ships they built, and the machines they powered. Raw materials from distant territories arrived in ports and warehouses, then moved into the industrial heart of Britain. Cotton fed the textile mills. Timber and metal supported construction and manufacturing. Coal-fired engines that powered industry. But for the working class at home, the empire was not a pathway to prosperity. It was something they felt indirectly. The empire's resources flowed into the country like a river. Yet most of those who depended on this system never saw where the river began. Life for the working class revolved around mills and mines. In Lancashire and Yorkshire, textile factories filled the air with the hum of machinery. Workers arrived before dawn, often leaving long after sunset. Cotton from overseas passed through their hands, woven into cloth that would be sent back across the world. The product traveled farther than the people who made it. The wealth it created moved upward, not outward. The workers remained where they were, tied to the rhythm of machines. In coal towns, the empire's economic reach turned into a physical burden. Miners descended into shafts where the darkness pressed against their skin. Their labor powered the ships that sailed to distant colonies and the railways that stitched Britain together. The coal they extracted fueled the industrial age, but the rewards were uneven. Those who profited most from the empire did so from a distance, without hearing the echoing tools or breathing the dust that filled the mines. Wages covered survival, not advancement. Those who profited most from the empire did so from a distance, without hearing the echoing tools or breathing the dust that filled the mines. Shipyards along the coasts reflected the same imbalance. Workers hammered iron plates into place, built hulls for merchant vessels, and repaired the engines of steamships that traveled routes drawn by imperial strategy. Their labor made the empire function. Yet they rarely knew the destinations of the ships they constructed. Ports grew busier every year, but the lives of the men who worked there remained narrow. Their world was measured in wages, not in horizons. For many families, life was a cycle of endurance. Housing in industrial cities was crowded. Streets were narrow, and smoke hung in the air from factory chimneys. Children contributed to the household income, working long hours to support their families. Education was limited. Advancement required time and resources that the working class did not have. The empire might have been celebrated in newspapers and patriotic songs. But for those struggling to make ends meet, it was a distant concept. There were moments when the empire entered their world more directly. Imported goods appeared in shops. Tea, sugar, and textiles became part of daily life. But even these connections carried contradictions. The goods were affordable because they came from systems that benefited owners more than workers. The same forces that created global trade also shaped the limits of local opportunity. The distance between the factory floor and the aristocratic estate was measured not only in class, but in experience. Public discussion of the empire often highlighted prosperity. But the prosperity was selective. Investors, merchants, and industrialists gained influence and status. Their names appeared in newspapers, on buildings, and in political office. The working class remained largely anonymous. Their contribution was essential, but it was not celebrated. The empire lifted profits, but it did not lift everyone with them. The divide between wealth and labor widened as the decades passed. Despite the hardships, there was resilience. Workers formed communities bound by shared struggle. They organized and demanded rights. People questioned whether the empire's wealth needed to be used differently. Conversations that began in taverns and meeting halls would grow louder in the decades to come. In this period, the working class lived in the shadow of the empire's promise. They saw the effects of global trade but not its advantages. They built ships, but never sailed them. They made cloth, but never wore the finest fabric. They produced wealth, but rarely touched it. Their contribution was foundational, yet the social structure kept them at the base. The people who worked the most felt the benefits the least. Meanwhile, the empire continued to expand. Territories were administered. Trade agreements were negotiated. Maps were redrawn. But inside the homes of industrial Britain, hope and struggle lived side by side. Some dreamed of advancement. Others focused only on survival. For most, the empire was not a path to a new life, but a background force that shaped the limits of their own. By 1860, the divide between classes was unmistakable. The aristocracy built estates. The middle class gained influence. The working class made the world function, yet remained confined by the weight of their responsibilities. Empire and industry had become inseparable. But the benefits of that partnership were not shared equally. This era revealed a truth that would echo through future generations. Power and profit can expand across oceans, but not everyone rises with them. The working class experienced the empire not as glory, but as consequence. Their story is not one of conquest or politics, but of daily endurance beneath the machinery of an age that celebrated progress while overlooking the people who made it possible. Soldiers of the Empire 1850 to 1880. Between 1850 and 1880, countless working-class men across Britain entered the empire not through commerce or politics, but through uniform. Recruitment posters hung in cities and towns, promising steady pay, discipline, and a chance to see the world. For men who faced limited opportunities at home, the army and navy offered something rare. A path. The promise of belonging. The suggestion that a single decision could carry them beyond the boundaries of their lives. Service became both opportunity and burden, shaping identities as surely as it shaped the empire itself. In factory towns and coastal ports, recruiters spoke of pride and purpose. Some men joined in search of adventure. Others joined out of necessity. Still others were encouraged by parents who believed military discipline could provide structure. The decision to enlist might be made in a moment, but its consequences stretched across years, continents, and memories. A signature on a recruitment paper became a passport to worlds many had never imagined. Training camps transformed civilians into soldiers. Days began before sunrise. Boots hit the ground in unison. Commands echoed across drill yards. Uniforms itched. Equipment felt heavy. Marches grew smoother. Rifles steadied in hand. Men learned to rely on the person beside them. Bonds formed not out of sentiment, but out of shared experience. These early weeks created a version of identity that depended on routine, trust, and obedience. Once posted overseas, the world expanded in ways that reshaped perception. Regiments traveled by ship to India, Africa, and the Middle East. The journey alone could take weeks. Some soldiers spoke excitedly about the places they had heard described in stories and newspapers. Others wondered what awaited them. Some soldiers stood on deck in silence, wondering what awaited them. Others spoke excitedly about the places they had heard described in stories and newspapers. None could fully predict what they would face. Arrival in distant territories offered new sounds, climates, and landscapes. The air felt unfamiliar. The cities and countryside looked different from anything they had known. They met people living ordinary lives under extraordinary circumstances. They realized that the empire did not exist only as the story told at home. It existed as reality for others. Life abroad for enlisted men was defined by discipline and hierarchy. Officers often came from wealthier backgrounds and held authority beyond rank alone. They maintained equipment, guarded supply routes, and marched through heat, dust, rain, and uncertainty. The divide was clear. Service offered identity, but it did not erase the lines of class. It reinforced them. Letters home became lifelines. Soldiers wrote about landscapes, markets, and people. Some described beauty. Others described tension. They rarely wrote about fear directly, but it lingered between the lines. Families read these letters aloud at kitchen tables, imagining places they would never see. Through these exchanges, military service shaped how ordinary Britons imagined the world. The empire became not just a political structure, but a personal connection. Not all experiences were noble or romantic. Some soldiers found themselves involved in conflicts they barely understood. They marched into situations shaped by policies and decisions made far away. They followed orders without knowing the full context. Soldiers learned that service could mean responsibility without authority. Despite the challenges, many men returned home with a sense of transformation. They had traveled farther than their ancestors. They had seen landscapes, cultures, and histories firsthand. Some returned with pride. Others returned with questions. Military service did not provide a single answer. It provided many. It created perspective rather than clarity. It offered experiences that remained long after the uniform was folded away. For the communities that welcomed these men back, the empire became fragmentary. It lived in stories told beside fires, in medals displayed on mantles, in silence held during moments of memory. It existed not in policy books or official reports. but in what soldiers remembered and chose to share. In some homes, those stories reinforced loyalty. In others, they introduced doubt. Either way, they changed how the empire was understood. Between 1850 and 1880, soldiers carried the empire on their shoulders, through heat and frost, across oceans and deserts. They built roads, guarded borders, and enforced decisions made in distant offices. They were ordinary men placed into extraordinary circumstances. Their experiences connected Britain to the world and the world to Britain. Their service formed a bridge between home and distant territories, a bridge built on routine, hierarchy, sacrifice, and endurance. The military shaped identity. It taught men to stand in formation, to follow orders, and to imagine themselves as part of something larger. But it also reminded them, at every level, that the empire was built by human lives rather than abstract ambition. The soldiers of this era did not write policy. They embodied it. They did not design the system. They moved within it. And through their footsteps, the shape of empire became real. As the decades passed, their stories would outlast the campaigns they served in. Their memories would survive the transformation of the empire itself. And the identity forged in uniform would continue to influence how Britain remembered its past. Victorian Britain emerged as a nation confident in its direction and purpose. From 1837 to 1901, under the rule of Queen Victoria, the empire grew not only in size but in imagination. The idea of empire became a symbol of national pride, woven into the identity of the country. It shaped the way people spoke, learned, worshipped, and worked. It influenced how Britons understood their place in the world. Victorian values did not just accompany the empire. They helped define it. Schools taught children that their nation had a special role beyond its borders. Lessons included stories of distant territories presented as places in need of guidance. Maps in classrooms showed the empire stretching across continents. They created the impression of a world organized by British presence. Children repeated facts about ports, trade routes, and explorers before they understood the complexity behind them. Education became a quiet introduction to a global identity, one that placed Britain at the center. Churches also contributed to this narrative. Sermons described the empire as an opportunity to spread faith and moral improvement. Missionaries traveled overseas with religious conviction, writing letters that were published at home and read aloud to congregations. They described journeys and encounters in dramatic detail. They reinforced the belief that Britain carried responsibility as well as influence. In parish halls and chapels, the empire became a moral mission as much as a political or economic one. Newspapers served as a daily reminder of imperial presence. Reports from across the world filled their pages. Victories, treaties, and expeditions appeared beside stories of trade and industry. Even routine updates created a sense of continuity. Readers could follow imperial developments as if they were neighborhood affairs. The world appeared smaller, more manageable, and more connected to British decisions. Newspapers framed empire as progress in motion. Museums became windows into foreign cultures. But those windows were shaped by Victorian interpretation. Artifacts, tools, and textiles were displayed as evidence of Britain's reach. Collections were arranged to show cultural difference without explaining cultural context. Exhibits created an illusion of understanding, as if the empire could be seen fully through glass cases. Visitors walked through galleries and left with the impression that they had encountered the wider world. In truth, they had encountered a version of it curated to support imperial confidence. Class structure played a crucial role in how these values developed. They held political office, managed estates, and invested in trade ventures. Their influence shaped policy at home and abroad. Empire supported their status because it provided new resources and new platforms for authority. They looked at the world and saw responsibility attached to their rank. The middle classes saw the empire as proof of their own progress. They worked in professions connected to banking, law, shipping, education, and administration. Many believed that their growing success was tied to the success of the empire. They spoke of improvement, industry, and modernity. They imagined themselves as participants in a wider project, not through inheritance but through effort. The empire became part of their identity as builders of the nation's future. For the working classes, the relationship was different but still significant. They supplied the labor that sustained industrial growth. They built ships, forged steel, and wove textiles. And packed goods for export. Their wages depended on contracts that reached across the world. Many never traveled far from home, yet their lives were connected to distant markets in ways they could not fully see. Loyalty to the empire became part of public life through parades, commemorations, and shared symbols. They carried pride even when they did not carry profit. These patterns created a national myth that felt natural, even inevitable. The class system and the empire fit together like two sides of the same coin. Leadership above, labor below, ambition in between. Each part reinforced the other. The structure of society shaped the structure of empire, and the structure of empire confirmed the structure of society. It became difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. Victorian values emphasized discipline, respectability, progress, and duty. In the imperial context, these values translated into expectations. Progress justified expansion. Duty justified administration. Respectability justified hierarchy. Discipline justified control. These ideas traveled with officials, merchants, missionaries, and soldiers. They shaped negotiations, policies, and decisions. They influenced how Britain saw itself, and how it wanted to be seen. Yet beneath the confidence, contradictions existed. Questions lingered about responsibility, cost, and consequence. Not everyone agreed with the mission of improvement. Not everyone shared in the benefits. But these concerns rarely outweighed the momentum of public belief. Pride was easier to hold than complexity. Certainty was easier to share than doubt. The empire felt like a rising tide, and Victorian society rose with it. By the late 19th century, symbols of empire appeared in public life everywhere. Statues, monuments, and commemorations celebrated figures connected to overseas expansion. Streets were named after foreign places. Ceremonies honored achievements abroad. These displays turned ideology into physical presence. The empire was not only a project. It was a landscape, visible in stone and memory. As Queen Victoria's reign approached its end, the imperial ideal felt complete. Britain saw itself as a nation leading the world toward modernity. The values that shaped the Victorian age had become inseparable from the structures of empire. Pride, confidence, and hierarchy formed the pillars of identity. The world beyond Britain's shores seemed connected to the island not by distance but by destiny. Looking back, the era from 1837 to 1901 reveals how ideas can shape nations as powerfully as armies or laws. Victorian values did not merely accompany the growth of empire. They defined it, supported it, and justified it. They built an image of Britain as a guiding force in global affairs. They encouraged generations to believe in the imperial ideal. The story of this era is not only one of expansion. It is a story of how a society saw itself. A story of how identity and ambition intertwined. Victorian Britain did not simply rule an empire. It believed in one. By the late 19th century, the British Empire no longer felt like a distant system of colonies and administrators. It lived inside the ordinary routines of daily life. People who never traveled beyond their hometown still felt the empire in the objects they used. And the lessons they learned. And the products they consumed. Without realizing it, millions lived with the empire every day. Tea greeted the morning in almost every household. Sugar dissolved into cups without a second thought. Cotton clothing wrapped around the body as naturally as breathing. Tobacco smoke drifted from pipe bowls and cigarette ends in pubs and parlors. The products of faraway plantations and trading posts became invisible companions. The empire entered homes not with fanfare, but with familiarity. In grocery shops, bright packaging promised flavor and refinement. Advertisements on walls and in newspapers used exotic imagery to attract buyers. They showed palm trees, distant landscapes, and illustrations of places most customers could not locate on a map. These images romanticized the world beyond Britain's borders. They made global trade feel like a source of wonder rather than a structure of control. Buying a product became a small act of participation in an international system. Kitchens became places where global and domestic life met. Imported spices and dried fruits appeared in recipes that felt traditional but were rooted in trade networks overseas. Sugar and tea jars never seemed foreign, even though they connected the household to plantations and shipping routes across oceans. The empire shaped taste itself. The foods that Britons considered normal were supported by systems far beyond view. In schools, maps hung from classroom walls, shading Britannia's territories in matching colors. Geography lessons described oceans as pathways of influence. History books praised explorers, governors, and admirals. Students repeated phrases that suggested the empire was natural, even necessary. Lessons shaped understanding before critical thought could develop. Young minds learned to associate power with purpose, trade with improvement, and expansion with responsibility. The classroom became an instrument of narrative. Museums displayed artifacts from across the empire. Visitors passed glass cases filled with weapons, jewelry, tools, and religious items taken from other cultures. These objects were rarely explained through the perspectives of the people who had created them. Instead, they were presented as curiosities. This display reinforced the sense that Britain stood above the world it collected from. It implied that the empire organized knowledge as well as territory. City streets showed empire in motion. Dockworkers unloaded crates stamped with names of distant ports. Steamships brought goods upriver. Warehouses stacked with imported materials stood beside factories that turned them into finished products. Shop signs referenced distant origins. Trains carried goods inland, so even towns far from the coast participated in the global exchange. People walked through scenes shaped by trade without needing to understand the machinery behind it. Advertisements in public spaces carried confidence. They encouraged buyers to believe that consumption was a form of progress. Soap wrappers, tobacco tins, and tea labels suggested that the empire improved life. Their messages were subtle but constant. With every purchase, consumers absorbed a story about identity. The empire became a companion to personal choice, shaping what people bought and what they expected from the world. In drawing rooms and parlors, conversations reflected this influence. Newspapers made global events feel close. Guests discussed colonial news as if it were neighborhood gossip. A new trade agreement, a military expedition, or an overseas rebellion could become a topic of light conversation. Evening papers described distant conflicts with the same tone used for domestic politics. The world seemed both large and small at the same time. Not everyone accepted these influences without question. Some observers recognized how deeply the empire had entered ordinary life. They worried about the ease with which familiarity disguised consequence. They wondered if Britain's daily comforts relied too heavily on systems that remained unseen by those who benefited from them. Their questions did not often drive public opinion, but they hinted at the conflicts that would grow in decades to come. For most, the empire did not feel like a political argument. It felt like routine. It appeared in objects rather than orders. It entered memory through habit rather than instruction. Over time, daily life and imperial influence became so closely bound that separating them seemed impossible. Even those with no interest in overseas affairs consumed the products of empire without choice. Participation became automatic. As the period approached 1914, the Empire's presence in daily life formed a quiet foundation for national identity. People believed in Britannia's global role because they lived with reminders of it. The empire was a teacup, a map, a museum display, a school lesson. A brand logo in a shop window and a headline on a newspaper stand. It was ordinary and constant. This everyday presence mattered because it shaped expectation. It convinced millions that the empire was stable, beneficial, and permanent. When war arrived in 1914, those expectations would be tested. The empire that had lived in kitchens and classrooms would become visible again, not through objects, but through people and sacrifice. The quiet influence of daily life would give way to a more difficult understanding. From 1880 to 1914, Britain did not simply rule an empire. It carried the empire home in parcels, folded it into fabric, and poured it into cups. And taught it to children. People who never saw a colony still lived with the influence of one. And in those ordinary moments, the empire became part of what it meant to be British. The cracks begin to show 1914 to 1918. When Britain entered World War I in 1914, the moment felt like a test of national strength. People believed the empire would endure the conflict as it had survived past challenges. But as months became years and the scale of the war became clear, something unexpected happened. The empire did not stand apart from its people. It leaned upon them. Every class and every corner of the imperial world became part of the struggle. The burden was shared, and because of that, questions began to form. In the early days of the war, the upper classes supplied officers and commanders. They arrived on battlefields with inherited rank or confidence earned in military academies. The structure of authority remained familiar, even as the world around them changed. These men led regiments composed of those from very different lives. The system of command reflected the old social order. But the trenches that awaited them cared nothing for orders of hierarchy. Shells and fire reached all ranks, making the war a place where status provided little shield. The middle classes stepped into roles that held the war together from behind the lines. They managed supply routes, coordinated hospitals, and worked in expanding government offices. Clerks, managers, and administrators became the nervous system of the war, organizing everything from food distribution to troop movement. Their value was no longer theoretical. It lived in paperwork, planning, and responsibility. For the working classes, the war arrived as a call that was impossible to ignore. Many enlisted from a sense of duty. Others joined because economic pressure pushed them toward the army. They marched to the front lines, where the war's reality was clearer than any newspaper could describe. Mud, trenches, and exhaustion defined their daily lives. They fought under officers drawn from the upper class, supported by systems managed by the middle class. The empire relied on their bodies as much as any weapon. Their sacrifice was constant, measurable in lives rather than ledgers. The empire's reach extended even further. From India, Africa, the Caribbean, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand came soldiers, labor corps, and support units. They sailed toward a war that had begun far from their homes. Some believed their service would bring respect. Others hoped it would lead to representation or improvement of conditions in their homelands. Many simply acted from loyalty, whether to crown, community, or fellow soldiers. They entered the war with expectations that could not be easily dismissed when peace arrived. On European battlefields, these different worlds met. British soldiers stood beside men from faraway countries whose villages they would never see. Officers issued orders to regiments whose languages and names they had not known before the war. At rail depots and field hospitals, administrators worked beside engineers and laborers who had come from thousands of miles away. The war revealed the empire not as a map or an abstract system, but as a network of human lives tied together by necessity. As casualties mounted, something shifted at home. Families who sent sons to the front began to ask what their sacrifice was for. Communities that had lost workers and fathers began to wonder what would change after the fighting ended. If working-class lives had been essential in war, should their rights not matter more in peace? If colonial troops had stood in the same trenches, facing the same dangers, should their voices not be heard in the decisions that shaped the empire? These questions did not yet break the system, but they cracked its surface. The newspapers that once spoke confidently of order and purpose now carried lists of the dead. Parades of recruitment were replaced with silent funerals. The familiar optimism of imperial certainty gave way to private conversation and doubt. In factories and street corners, people quietly wondered if the world after the war could remain the same as the world before it. They did not yet use the language of reform, but the thought of change settled like dust in the spaces where certainty had lived. By 1917, even those who had once believed unquestioningly in empire could feel the shift. Officers saw the weight of command differently after losing men whose names they had learned in trenches. Administrators realized that the machinery of empire required more than obedience. It required fairness if it hoped to endure. Soldiers returning from the front carried not only memories of the war, but expectations. If they had given their lives to preserve the empire, then the empire owed them something in return. In colonial territories, these expectations became sharper. Veterans returned home aware that they had fought under the same flag as British soldiers. They had seen Europe. They had seen the empire from its center. They could not be told that their role was minor or temporary. Communities gathered to welcome them back, proud and unsettled. If service proved loyalty, then loyalty should be recognized. If sacrifice proved commitment, then commitment should have consequence. At the end of the war in 1918, celebrations swept across Britain and the empire. Bells rang. Crowds filled city squares. Newspapers announced victory. But beneath the joy was a new understanding. The empire had endured the war, but it had not survived unchanged. The cost had been too high for old assumptions to remain untouched. The cracks did not break the structure in that moment. The empire stood. But the splits in its foundation had begun. They appeared in the quiet recognition that power demanded responsibility. They appeared in the realization that sacrifice required respect. They appeared in the questions that could no longer be answered with confidence alone. Between 1914 and 1918, the empire learned what it had long ignored. It was held together not only by authority, but by people. People who commanded, people who managed, people who labored, and people who fought. And once those people understood the price they had paid, they began to ask what should come next. Between 1919 and 1947, the British Empire entered a long dusk of uncertainty. The First World War had left the nation exhausted, financially strained, and forced to reconsider the foundations of its global power. The victory that once promised glory instead brought doubt. The empire still stretched across continents, but its confidence no longer felt unshakable. Protests rose overseas. Debates grew louder at home. The world that had celebrated empire now began to question whether it had a future. In London, newspapers that once spoke proudly of overseas dominion began to acknowledge unrest. Reports from India, Africa, and the Middle East described demonstrations, petitions, and new political organizations. These events were no longer distant disturbances. They were signs of change, written clearly in public view. Britain had entered a time when the empire could not be taken for granted. Ordinary citizens found themselves wondering if the system that had shaped their identity for generations could still endure. Across the empire, new leaders stepped forward. In cities, rural communities, and coastal ports, people demanded accountability, rights, and representation. Movements formed with different ideologies but shared goals. They challenged legal systems, questioned economic structures, and pushed back against decisions made far away. The call for independence was not a single voice. It was a chorus, rising in volume year after year. At home, economic pressure deepened the sense of instability. The 1920s brought brief optimism followed by frustration. The Great Depression then struck with full force. Unemployment climbed. Factories closed. Mines fell silent. Families rationed food and fuel. The empire had been described as a source of prosperity, yet it could not shield Britain from hardship. This contradiction changed public perception. Those who once celebrated imperial strength began to ask what the empire actually provided in return. Class divisions widened. The wealthy attempted to preserve their status. But the middle and working classes felt the weight of crisis. Others stood on picket lines or participated in general strikes. It became more difficult to argue that the empire guaranteed national stability when daily life proved otherwise. The belief that overseas territory supported domestic well-being no longer matched experience. Yet not everyone accepted decline. Some clung tightly to the old story. To them, the empire symbolized identity, memory, and sacrifice. It represented everything Britain had once achieved. They believed that letting go would mean losing more than territory. It would mean losing purpose. These voices defended the empire in parliament, in newspapers, and on street corners. They described it as a legacy worth preserving. But the world outside those speeches kept changing. During this period, independence movements gained momentum. In India, mass mobilization made imperial rule increasingly difficult to sustain. Every year brought new demonstrations, new negotiations, and new pressure. The idea of independence spread from meetings and rallies into everyday conversation. It was no longer a distant dream. It was an approaching horizon. Elsewhere in the empire, similar questions took shape. In Africa, reformers challenged systems that denied representation. They formed unions, councils, and community networks. Even those who did not call for immediate independence recognized that the structure needed to evolve. The Second World War accelerated this shift. Britain relied on soldiers and resources from across the empire. Men and women served in Europe, North Africa, and Asia. They risked their lives in a fight for freedom. And when the war ended, they expected that freedom to apply at home. Britain emerged from the conflict victorious, but tired. Defending the empire had taken an immense toll. The narrative of invincibility had vanished. Something new had taken its place, shaped by loss, sacrifice, and realism. In the post-war years, the question was no longer whether change would come. It was how quickly. Britain faced a choice between holding on and letting go. Some officials believed the empire could be reformed. Others accepted that the world had entered a new era. Public opinion was divided. The pride of earlier generations persisted. But doubt had taken root. By 1947, that doubt became history. India achieved independence, marking a turning point. The event carried political, economic, and symbolic weight. It showed that the empire could be challenged. It showed that demands for self-determination were not temporary. They were inevitable. In Britain, the realization settled quietly. The country did not collapse. It adjusted. Citizens looked toward rebuilding their own society rather than managing others. The idea of empire no longer defined the nation. Instead, Britain began to imagine what it could be without global control. For some, this was a relief. For others, it was a loss. Either way, it was real. The decline of the British Empire between 1919 and 1947 was not a single event. It was a slow shift in perception. It was doubt becoming recognition. It was independence becoming fact. The movements that reshaped the world did not break the empire in one blow. They unbuilt it piece by piece, until the foundations could no longer hold. And when those foundations weakened, the age of imperial certainty ended, leaving a world that would never be the same. The end of empire and the class shift 1947 to 1950. Between 1947 and 1950, Britain entered a world it had not been prepared to face. The empire that once stretched across continents began to contract. And with it, the foundations of the old class system shifted. The age of aristocratic certainty and inherited authority no longer matched the realities of a nation recovering from war. The post-war years demanded reconstruction, reconciliation, and reinvention. What had once been held together by global markets, colonial wealth, and distant territories was now forced to stand on its own. Britain could not return to what it had been. It had to become something new. The end of empire exposed how deeply colonial profit had supported the older social order. Nobility who once relied on overseas investments and imperial commerce watched their financial security weaken. Estates that had survived for centuries on rent and dividends now faced taxation, maintenance costs, and shrinking returns. Land alone could not sustain an aristocratic lifestyle. The certainty that birth guaranteed stability faded. Titles still carried prestige, but prestige no longer guaranteed influence. In drawing rooms and inherited halls, conversations quietly shifted from tradition to survival. The middle classes experienced a different transformation. Their future no longer depended on overseas appointments, military administration, or imperial trade. Instead, their ambitions turned inward. Engineering firms reopened to rebuild infrastructure. Schools and universities expanded to teach new skills rather than imperial management. Civil service roles changed focus from colonial governance to domestic policy. Professions adjusted to new expectations. Their careers redefined by a country that no longer ruled an empire, but needed to rebuild itself. The middle classes experienced a different transformation. For working people, the moment carried tension and possibility. During the war, millions had worked, fought, or served in ways that broke the old boundaries of social expectation. They returned home with new confidence. They demanded wages that reflected labor, not status. They demanded housing that reflected dignity, not scarcity. They demanded representation in decisions that shaped their lives. Trade unions held more influence than ever before, and the political landscape shifted beneath their weight. The working class pushed against the hierarchy that had defined their place for generations. The government responded by expanding welfare protections, housing projects, and employment programs. These were not gifts. They were acknowledgments. Britain needed its citizens to rebuild the nation, and rebuilding required change. The post-war era forced the state to look inward. It could not depend on overseas resources, and so it turned to domestic reform. Public spending increased. Healthcare transformed. Education advanced. The future depended on competence rather than inheritance. In these years, class survived, but the empire that had shaped it no longer did. In factories and shipyards, the atmosphere shifted. Wartime production had created unity in purpose. But peacetime revealed the fractures that still existed. Men and women who had labored for survival now worked for improvement. They expected more than obedience. They expected opportunity. Newspapers printed stories about labor strikes and parliamentary debates, signaling that authority was being renegotiated. The spectacle of empire had once dominated headlines. Now, the headlines centered on wages, housing, and reform. The world outside Britain no longer defined the conversation. The world inside Britain did. Universities also reflected these changes. Classrooms that once prepared young men for imperial administration now taught economics, science, and social policy for a different purpose. Students studied new forms of government, new alliances, and new responsibilities. Professors spoke about a world in which power depended on negotiation rather than command. The idea of leadership evolved. Influence became something earned, not inherited. In rural areas, estates changed hands or adapted to new realities. Some opened to the public as historical sites, transforming private privilege into public memory. Others sold land to pay taxes or finance repairs that had been delayed for decades. Families with centuries of lineage watched their authority shrink not through revolution, but through economics. Respect for heritage still existed, but the emotional distance between past and present widened. The village, once defined by hierarchy, became defined by coexistence. Cities reflected the shift even more clearly. Streets that had once echoed with confidence now buzzed with reconstruction. Builders laid foundations for housing estates that would shelter families displaced by war. Trams and buses connected neighborhoods that had been isolated before. New industries appeared in warehouses left empty by the collapse of imperial shipping. The skyline did not rise in tribute to empire. It rose in response to need. The transformation was physical as well as social. By 1950, the class system remained. But it no longer resembled the one that had existed before the war. Nobility still held titles, but not unquestioned authority. The middle class expanded, but without imperial certainty to anchor it. The working class continued to fight for rights that could not be denied. Britain stood without its empire, yet still carried the weight of what the empire had left behind. Legacy became something to examine rather than preserve. In these years, the empire was not erased. It became memory. A subject for reflection rather than identity. The end of empire did not destroy class, but it altered its purpose. Class survived, but it changed shape. It answered not to distant territories, but to domestic reality. Britain became something new, not by choice alone, but by necessity. The transformation of 1947 to 1950 did not arrive as a single moment. It arrived as a quiet shift in expectation. A change in what it meant to lead. A change in what it meant to belong. And in that redefinition, the old world ended while a new world began. Thank you for spending this time exploring history. The connection between Britain's empire and its class system reminds us that global power does not stay overseas. It returns home. It enters homes, wages, identities, and futures. Empires rise and fall. Class systems shift and rebuild. But the stories they leave behind help us understand the world we live in today. Until next time, take care, stay curious, and keep learning from the past.